so much for coming this evening. We are in for a treat to hear about a train wreck. Unfortunately, some fatalities, but a very interesting story. This is the 12th annual Woiak History Festival. We've been doing this for 12 years. And many of you have been here both in the winter series and the summer series, and we're very pleased that we can continue for 12 years and on doing these kinds of lectures, because obviously you're interested. And so thank you again for coming. Just a preview, we have one more for the summer series, and that will be on Tuesday, August 8th, and it is the downtown fire in Washburn, 1888. And information about that fire, Bob Pete Mann, who is here, is going to be telling us about that time and that fire. So mark your calendars for August 8th, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. I'm now going to ask, now how can I, Gary Holman, I just had a moment there, and I couldn't remember his name, but I can see him, he's right here. So Gary Holman is going to come up and introduce tonight's presenter. Gary?
Okay. I'm so glad to hear that Pete's going to do this story about the Great Fire. I was only 8 years old when that fire happened. I didn't know much about it. So our presenter this evening is no stranger to this Tony Woiak series. In fact, he was one of the originators of the series that would have had to been about 12 years ago, and thank you for that. He's a self-confessed history buff. He has been studying local history for quite some time, and he has previously provided us with a number of interesting presentations about Washburn's history. So one of his earlier presentations was about the explosives, the first 50 years of the explosives works at Barksdale, DuPont explosives works. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you tonight Bob Mackreth.
Thank you very much, Gary. And just so people are, clear on this, I'm going to be talking about a train wreck, and I'm hoping that my presentation will not be referred to as one. And Karen, as far as moments, Karen, where'd you go there? Yeah. I had one. If you read the blurb, in the flyer sent around, I said this is a train wreck where 9 men died. And then after it came out, I was, no, Bob, it was 10. So, there was a moment there, but I have to admit, that kind of moment has lasted a lifetime. I've never been good at mathematics. And when I say mathematics, I'm not talking about calculus or intermediate algebra. I'm talking about numbers where you have to use more than 1, 2 hands. It's like, I get lost, but which is why Susan does the checkbook. We'll move on from that and just talk about this incident, which to me, it absolutely blows my mind that it has been as forgotten as it seems to have been. I first started, well, let's put it this way, I first found out about it, not in a history book, not in the course of my archival research, but on a walk through the cemetery in Ashland, the Mount Hope Cemetery. And it was a lovely day in autumn, and I was just strolling around looking for the graves of some of the noteworthies from local history, and there are plenty of them. Benjamin Armstrong, Sam Fifield, a couple generations of John Chappell's. And then I came across this stone, which I hadn't really known anything about. It's very close to Sanborn Avenue, easy to find. And what it reads, in memory of Frank Carlson, Matthew Connell, Fred Herlin, Andrew L. Johnson, and Patrick Nayless, all of whom were injured at Pikes Creek near Bayfield, Wisconsin, October 2nd, 1884, and died soon after. You go, whoa, what was that all about? So I started looking and digging into my usual sources, and I finally came up with some information on this book and this book here, The Lake Superior Country in History and in Story by Guy Burnham. Now this is a book that was originally published in 1929. Guy Burnham, as a longtime newspaperman in Ashland, around the turn of the century and well into the 1930s, and the guy wrote voluminously on historical topics. And he put all together a book. It's very, very enjoyable reading. It's not it's not an authoritative history in the sense of going from 0 to 2000 or 2023 or something. It's just a whole lot of stories he likes to tell all together. And so it's hard to find stuff, but when you do, it's quite well written. And this is what I found out from Mr. Burnham's book. First of all, we had a locomotive like this. This is not a locomotive from our area. It's out west, but it's pretty much, as far as I can tell, the same model of locomotive that was engaged in the train wreck. And this, we'll call it this locomotive here for the sake of argument, ended up a lot like this. This, what we have here, is a photo recently found in the archives of the Washington Historical Society Museum, right across the street, a couple blocks. And when I got a look at it, I said, oh my heavens, that's gotta be it. That's gotta be the wreck. And then I started looking a little closer, and whoops, something happened here. There we go. I'll use my own little pointer, I think. Yeah, I started looking, and the damage didn't match. And I saw this dog, so I always zoom in on what the dog is. I want to see whether they're happy or not. And looks there's a fence behind it. Well, that doesn't look like what you would find at Pikes Creek. So it's a great and interesting picture, one of many treasures there in the museum, but it's not the wreck I'm talking about. Instead, we have to go, for the moment at least, by Mr. Burnham's description, in which he said, there was a large log dam on Pikes Creek near the present fish hatchery 44 years ago, and this dam gave way suddenly at midday. The rushing waters stormed down the bay, tearing out 2 bridges and the railroad track. Word was received at Washburn, and the local work train in charge of conductor John McCoy and engineer James Babington and Lewis Morris firemen started from Washburn about noon. Well, I'd already done some more research, and I found it's been raining like cats and dogs for the whole week. There was flooding all over the North Country, some bridges out at Eau Claire. It was really a tough storm to deal with on the primitive road and railroad systems that existed at the time. So they're heading up there to fix the washout of the bridge over Pikes Creek. And it says they had 3 flat cars loaded up, piling and ties to be used in repair work. There was no caboose, and most of the crew of workers rode on the engine and tender, 2 men riding on the cowcatcher up front. The work train reached the Pikes Creek at about 2:30. The approach to the bridge suddenly gave way. The engine plunged into the creek. The 3 loaded flat cars telescoped and fell into the creek. And to add to the horror, and here's the really bad part, a broken rail from the track forced its way through the firebox and into the boiler, and scalding steam began to pour out. One of the men started to run to Bayfield, 3 miles away, and reported the disaster there. Telegrams were sent to Ashland, and Dr. G.W. Harrison left on the steamer Walden. Notice they were responding to an emergency by boat. That's how primitive the road system was in those days. The dead Dr. Jardine came by a special train from Washburn. The dead and the injured were brought as far as Washburn, from which place Harrison wired Dr. Ellis, who was then the county judge, to have everything prepared for their arrival. Those who were still alive were taken to the Wisconsin and Michigan Hospital on Stuntz Avenue and to St. Joseph's Hospital. 9 men were either dead or so badly injured that they died within 24 hours, and others were injured. There's not too much of Ashland in 1884, and the bringing of the 16 dead and injured here taxed the energies of the community to the utmost. A house-to-house canvass for bedding and necessary material for the sick and dying was headed, we are informed, by Dr. Booth, the dentist. Women formed sewing bees to make quilts and bedding. It is doubtful that a worse tragedy ever occurred in this vicinity than that of October 2nd, 1884. Well, there's a lot to unpack in there. First of all, again, you get an idea of the very challenging transportation capacities we had. One doctor had to come by boat from Ashland, another had to wait until they made up the special train. They got there, and Mr. Burnham's account hints at the grievousness of the injuries. Most of the men were either crushed or scalded to death by the steam. Horrifying. Some other accounts that I came up later go into vast and gruesome detail, and I am not going to share them with you tonight, so don't worry. I'd like to go back to the one sentence he says. It is doubtful if a worse tragedy ever occurred in this vicinity than that of October 2nd, 1884. Well, why isn't it spoken of more? I mean, you stop and think about it. We talk about shipwrecks all the time around here. We sing songs about them, for heaven's sake. This thing has just completely disappeared off the map. I looked and searched for books, videos, anything. Zero zip. The only mention I ever found in a published source is this one book that was published nearly more than 90 years ago itself. It's kind of absolutely just disappeared. And yet, as Mr. Burnham says, community rallied together. There was a absolute, full-bore emergency reaction from everybody in Ashland, it says. Women were quilting and making blankets, and the doctors and the dentists were all pitching in. It should be something that the folks in Ashland ought to, be celebrating as well, their response in a time of emergency. And there were a number of questions that I had about, well, how in the world did this happen? Basically, it says, had a train sent to repair a bridge after the bridge had been washed out by this thunderous flood, and it drove willy-nilly right straight into the gap. Really? At 3:30 in the afternoon, was the engineer that drunk? Or what? Wow, talk about carelessness. And we can give a lot by saying, the weather I'm sure the weather was inclement. I'm sure the visibility was limited. But when you sent to repair a bridge, you don't go charging right up to it to the point you can't stop and go in. And then there was a couple other things. First, it's like this fellow who ran 3 miles to Bayfield. If the train went off the rails on the south side of this roaring stream, how did this guy cross it to get to Bayfield? A couple other things that are only of interest to railroad nerds like me. I mean, he talks about how the flat cars telescoped telescoping is a dreaded event in the old days of lightweight passenger cars, when one passenger car would ride over into the other and, like, closing a telescope and squash the passengers inside. Flat cars aren't going to do that. There's no, it's not the kind of thing. They just have a platform. They don't telescope. They just go the hell over. So I don't know. I was basically scratching my head. We had a definite puzzle to deal with. I had a lot of other, interests in mind, and kind of let it sit for a while. And then about 2 years ago, I started researching in earnest again. And before we go into the really research work, I'd like to do a refresher on the transportation system around here, the development of the network, because I realize not everybody is the nerd that I am. So if we go drop back for just a bit to the very earliest years of white settlement around here, right after the Treaty of 1854 opened up the area. We had 4 major settlements in this neck of the woods, and I think we all know their names. Ashland, and we got Bayfield, and we got Superior, Duluth, and a whole lot of wild country. And those 4 settlements kind of waxed and waned for a bit for the first couple of decades, especially Ashland and Superior, which had real boom and bust in their population for a while. And not too much happened in the way of development till after the Civil War, when things started to pick up again. And by about 1870 or 1871, one of our well-known entrepreneurs, R.D. Pike, partnered with a guy to set up a stage line. And of course, that was mostly for winter travel, because in the summertime, we have this lovely lake that you can travel on if it's not too nasty. But in the wintertime, when the lake was frozen over, only thing you could do was hoof it. You're not going to take your horses necessarily through that kind of thing, but deep snow and all. So Mr. Pike set up a stage line, and he established 4 way stations, rest stops, basically. Hot shops on the turnpike, that sort of thing. There were a total of 4 of them, and I think I put 3 on there. So again, my math skills are in evidence. But there was one at Moose Lake. They were all basically a day's travel apart. One at Moose Lake, one at Pine Lake, one at Brule, 44 miles from Ashland, one at Poplar River, 60 miles. And then finally, you made it all your way to Superior, distance of 77 miles along that. And when I say stage line, keep in mind that it might have been horse and wagon type things, but it also was just as likely to have been a horse-drawn sleigh, because really those are much better adapted for winter travel around here. And, that it was less than ideal, I'd say. Trying to get through there in the winter, and you had incidents like in February 1872, a young, hard-driving businessman named Henry Sweet was in Superior, and he wanted to get back to Bayfield in a hurry. He was the son of Alanson Sweet, who was a big-shot entrepreneur down in Milwaukee, and he had his fingers everywhere, including he was one of the contractors who built the first lighthouse on Michigan Island, and he also opened the first quarry in the Apostles. And his son Henry was following in his footsteps, and for whatever reason, he was in a hurry to get back. Well, man proposes, God disposes. Hell of a blizzard came up. He made it to the first rest station, and it was just too much to go out for the whole next day. Wednesday comes around, and people advise him, you need to stick around. It's not passable yet. It's not going to be safe. But he was a type A personality, I suppose, and he decided, I'm going to do it. And you think you can figure out what I'm going to say next, because we wouldn't be talking about him if he'd actually made it there. Young Mr. Sweet got exhausted on the trail, His friends ran to get him help, but by the time they get back to him, he was done. That made a lot of news at the time because of his connections down there in Milwaukee. But, you know, here's a note as usual for a while, but it was a little note in the Ashland Daily Press in March of 1874. We are glad to chronicle the safe return home of Mrs. E.C. Davis from a visit to friends at Winona. Mrs. Davis came via the Duluth route through the storm of last Saturday and Sunday and was much fatigued with the journey. Between Superior City and Brule Station, the road was so badly drifted over that the driver was compelled to stamp the snow down for the horses until he became so cold and exhausted as to be obliged to lie down under the buffalo robes, and Mrs. Davis drove the team 16 miles herself, arriving at the station after nightfall. The horses had all they could do in some of the drifts to draw the sleigh its length without stopping to rest. Yeah, pioneer women were tough, if you have any doubt about it. Get out of my way, I'll take the horses for a while. Well, again, that's not less than ideal, but, you know, the conditions weren't ready yet to do much of improvement. But as a couple of years went by, the railroad frenzy begins to strike. And, you know, there's a line that's coming up from Milwaukee, it's making its way as far as Stevens Point. Folks in Ashland say, we'll build southward to meet them. And in 1872, they start building a road south from Ashland. They get as far as a place called in those days Pinocchio Gap, when they ran into a bit of a obstruction. Now, I believe that's a little exaggerated there, but the Pinocchio Mountains were quite difficult to get through with the technology of that day. And basically, the folks behind it, the railroad, ran out of cash. Well, that didn't just cause problems with, you know, in terms of the delay of the railroad, because you had all sorts of workmen out there under execrable conditions who weren't about to get paid. Now, just getting to the workplace was an ordeal for a lot of these guys. They came in with the promise of jobs from all over, and they ended up getting on boats from Ontonagon, getting other boats to Ashland, walking many miles just to get down to the work site. You know, there was no roads for them to take. And with the bankrupt promoters scrounging around for cash, they came up with all sorts of schemes and deals to try and delay payment. And you had several camps worth of tough railroaders sitting there twiddling their thumbs in the cold, waiting to get paid so they can go somewhere else and maybe get some work. And then one day in, let's see, it's February of 1873, the paymaster comes down with one of the other bureaucrats and a couple of security guys, and he gets to the first camp on the line, and he says, okay, guys, tell you what we're going to do. We're going to pay you off in installments or in groups. We'll pay folks at one camp, and then we'll let it sit for a while because it's just so hard to get from here back to civilization, and there's no hotels, and we don't want to make it too hard for you or burden the community. So we'll pay a few guys first, and then we'll pay a few more guys, and then we'll pay more. I think you can imagine how well that went over with the railroaders. Yeah, sit here freezing your duff off in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, waiting for them to show up and say, yeah, you're in the group we're paying today. And they didn't just, you know, grumble about it. They didn't complain on Twitter. They got kind of violent. And pretty soon the guys from the railroad promoters hightailed it out of there. And the Ashland sheriff came by with 20 men, took one look at this whole crowd of angry railroaders and said, we need to get a bigger boat or more men. So they telegraphed to Bayfield, and our friend R.D. Pike, who is always on top of everything, rounds up 42 men in a militia company that he calls the Bayfield Rifles, and he heads down to back up the men from Ashland. And so now you got 60 armed men down there, 20 from Ashland County, 20 more, 42 more from Bayfield, and that finally breaks up the insurrection. And an insurrection is not a, it's too strong a word. Those guys were really about to kill some people. Well, it finally blew over without any deaths. And then for the next several months, Bayfield and Ashland bickered who should be paying for it. Finally, the state stepped in and said, "You guys shut up, we'll pay for it." And the state took the burden on. But enough of that. Let's move on to the next stage, because we want to get to the place where the railroads are actually run, and we finally achieved some of that in 1878, when they finally get some money again and build the railway through Pinocchio Gap. It connects to the railroad that's coming up from Stevens Point, and voila, you can get from Ashland all the way down to Milwaukee without having to walk any of the way. And that's great, but it still leaves the folks here up on the Chequamegon Peninsula high and dry. It does nothing if you want to go anywhere east and west, but things are changing. And in 1883, there's a whole bunch of railroad construction. The Chicago, St. Paul and Omaha Railroad, which everyone called the Omaha Road, built a branch and went all the way up to Bayfield. And with my apologies to my Bayfield friends in here, I know what they really wanted was to get here to Washburn, and then they just had some track left over to get to me. But in any event, that was the year that the railroad decided that they're going to make Washburn into this great big bustling grain terminal. So they poured money into Washburn for a while, and then extended the road up to Bayfield as well. The Northern Pacific, brainchild of the financier J. Cook, built a line from Duluth to Superior and terminated in Ashland. Ashland was actually the eastern terminus of the Great Northern Pacific Railroad, rather. And a year after that, built another line connecting to the east. And we're practically in the modern era. Almost as good as the interstate, or some of us might say better. But in any event, the railroads had their heyday, but it wasn't more than about 50 years that they started to fade. And we have here, for instance, the city of Washburn in its early days, and what do we see? Right there, and very prominently, we see, well, you see railroad trains. And over here, kind of hard to make out. There we go. Railroad train over here, you can actually make out the smoke, and if you blow it up enough, I can tell there's what they call a diamond stack. So I knew basically what kind of locomotive to start looking for. Boxcars over here. So again, railroads played a huge role in the development of Washburn. It's basically why this city is here. This because a railroad said this is a good place to make grain for. But anyway, as they say, that began to fade. People started driving their own automobiles, and the demand for passenger services kind of faded away. And in the 1930s, they started discontinuing services. And like here we have the Washburn Station, place that brought trains to participate in the economy, the backbone of the local economy. They brought raw materials to the plant in Barksdale. They transported everything from fish to beans, products of the area. And they also carried vacationers, tourists, like this group of early 1920s sorority sisters coming back from a weekend on Sand Island. That's Gert Wellish, our doll folks, and our dolls, and that and her friends. And in the 30s, they had the CCC boys disgorged here at Washburn Station. So many things. The men from Washburn who went up to the Klondike to pan for gold at the height of the gold rush. saw them off at the station here in Washburn. I dare you to find it now. And railroad experiment, 1930s, late 20s, early 30s, they had this self-contained motor car, a couple of diesel engines in it. Problem is, after they used it for a while, they found that it cost more for fuel than if they were using coal. And then March of 1934, they ran the last scheduled passenger train into Bayfield. And to give you an idea of how short-lived passenger service was here, there was a woman on the train, Mrs. O.A. Brinsky. She was riding the train on the last day of its service. She'd been a kid and rode the brand new train on its very first day of service. So she had something to tell the grandkids about, I guess. Well, freight service went on for a while longer, but again, that went away too. The very last train tread its wheels on the Bayfield branch left Washburn on March of 1978. And with that, it's April 1978. And with that, railroading was history, just a memory in this neck of the woods. Photo there taken by Washburn's photographer laureate, Chick Sheridan. For any other railroad nerds in the room here? It's an EMD Jeep 7, built in 1952, but okay, everybody forget that I said that. So anyway, that's our little recap of the railroad history around here. Let's go back to our railroad mystery. And let's take a look, for instance, down the old railroad line in the vicinity of Pikes Creek. Are there any clues that we can find as to where the incident might have actually taken place? You know, I took this photo here over the weekend, and you notice the foliage is rather thick. I prefer really to go there in the winter, and you can see a lot more of what's out there. And they say, oh, hello, what is this? Yes, it's a rail. A little trace of what had been there once. And you keep going down the trail a bit, and you come to this lovely little bridge over a small stream. And then you walk a few hundred yards or so beyond that, the terrain starts rising. So we got an idea that somewhere around that location of the bridge, south back to Pikes Creek, is where something might have taken place. But I still don't understand. He's saying that the train went over the bridge. I'm confused. Well, you know, I finally said, I got to do some serious research here. And I stuck my head in the microfilm reader for quite a while, and it went online for various other papers. And this is big news back then. It was all over the place. One of those headlines comes from the New York Times, for heaven's sake. A lot of people, you know, heard about it back then. And these newspaper articles added quite a few details to Mr. Burnham's account, including some of the more gruesome ones, which I say I will leave to your imagination. But I'll tell you what, though, you know, the eureka moment was in our own hometown Bayfield Press. And it says, a heartrending scene, says the headline. Construction train runs into washout at Pikes Creek, resulting in the death of 2 men and seriously injuring many others. Okay, that headline was obviously set before the rest of the article was completed, because further down they say, well, hey, more people died. But here, you know, here's the text. It says, Thursday afternoon, a terrible accident occurred near Pikes Creek, 3 miles south of this village. Let me just step here forward, to a construction train which resulted in killing 2 men and seriously wounding a number of others. The particulars are as follows. A washout occurred on the railroad 1/4 mile south of this town after the departure of the morning train from St. Paul. It goes into, wait a minute. What's this other washout? What's this, what? not saying anything at all about the Pikes Creek Bridge. Let's keep going. A washout occurred on the railroad 1/4 mile south of this town. The construction train at Washburn was ordered to repair the same. They're dispatching the train to go well beyond Pikes Creek, almost all the way to Bayfield. Curiouser and curiouser. When they reached Pikes Bay, the train was running about 15 miles an hour, and just after crossing the bridge across the creek, they ran into an old washout in the old bed of the creek. Bingo. Mr. Burnham, who's usually a very reliable source, he was a professional newspaperman, he knew about checking his sources, somewhere managed to mess up the details. Now, consider this. He was writing almost 45 years after the incident took place. So it's not like he was there to see it up close. He was trying to reconstruct from the sources he had, and perhaps, I don't know, perhaps he heard a little word of mouth or something, but he managed to mess it up. And I'm not just going by the Bayfield County Press account. Every written account at the time talks about a washout a short way north of the bridge over Pikes Creek as they were on their way to repair not the Pikes Creek Bridge, but a washout all the way up toward Bayfield. So when look at it that way, it makes a heck of a lot more sense. Because a washout, might be something like this, little culvert here. Be easy to miss in the rain and the fog, but it certainly would be enough to derail a locomotive. And suddenly, it becomes a lot clearer. But of course, the question is now, where do we look for it? And we can take a look at overview of the place. And I think we're all very familiar with that neck of the woods. We've got, I tricked with the map to make it fit on the screen better, but we've got over here, this Fort Superior Marina. Over here's the fish hatchery. Washburn is down this way. Bayfield is up that way. Makes a big sweeping curve around the head of Pikes Bay. And if you look, like I say, we have a stretch here that's fairly level from about here over to here. And then after that, the terrain goes up. So I think we have a fairly good, at least, prime area to search. And again, let's take a closer look. There's Pikes Creek there. And we know that they got over that. And then you go, another, almost a 1/4 mile, and you get to another smaller stream, which we now know is Birch Run. And Birch Run today, of course, has a lovely bridge over it. But in the article, it says no mention of a bridge anywhere near there. So I suspect in those days, they had it run through a culvert. And culverts, we know, are often washed out. So when I had that in mind, the next time I walked there, I said, bingo. I can't say that for sure. This is strictly my hypothesis. And among the reasons we have to take this as just a hypothesis is because, first of all, streams wander around. And second of all, in the days since that railroad was first going through there, they built Highway 13 and completely changed the hydrography in the area. So we can't say, yes, it definitely happened here, but I'm happy to say it probably happened somewhere around here. Somewhere in that stretch. Possibly where Birch Run is now, possibly closer to Pikes Creek is where the action was. Did the papers tell us anything else? Well, let's see. Let's go back and refer to them. As a result of the railroad disaster near Pikes Creek, Wisconsin on Thursday, 7 men are dead, 3 are dying, and 2 are missing, and it's supposed are under the wreck. So from 9 men, now we have essentially 10 men who died and 2 more who are missing. So we can, at the very least, we can revise Mr. Burnham's estimate from 9 up to 10, and I'll show you why I'm sure of that in a little bit. And more mystery here. And let's see, anything else we, oh yeah, you know, we don't want to discourage the railroad company from being up here. We believe it is the intention of the company to thoroughly investigate the lake accident, and while they can in no wise be held accountable, so far as neglect on their part is concerned, for the loss of life and bodily injury sustained, they can and will undoubtedly do all within their power to comfort the afflicted. Okay, so let me see. You're killed in an on-the-job accident in a horrible, gruesome manner, and the company will send your widow some turkeys every Thanksgiving. Yeah, it was a different life in those days. Golly. But, okay. Too many different things. Yeah, I just don't want to get it. All right, yeah. So, what we have that I can say with some degree of assuredness is there's our quarter-mile stretch, right? On the left, the bridge at Pikes Creek. On the right, the area where the terrain begins to rise. Somewhere in that particular stretch, 10 men lost their lives, and maybe a couple more. I doubt that there was more than 10, because there was no mention ever in any further news account of additional casualties. And they did give updates. They talked about the repair crews coming down to fix this, that, and the other thing. They mentioned, you know, the folks who were supposedly dying. Well, when they did finally meet their maker, the papers did talk about it. So if they discovered 2 more bodies, I'm sure one of the papers would have mentioned it. So what we have here is an incident that matches in terms of severity with any other incident that took place in the area. And I don't want to get into a fatality Olympics. But again, there's only one shipwreck in this area that had the same number of casualties. That is the Lucerne, which sank off of Long Island almost the same time as this. The famous Savona wreck, the Pretoria wreck, 7 men, 5 men, whatever. And again, every one of those deaths is a tragedy. But this is an absolute, you know, very distinct event that shook the folks of this area, influenced to some degree the community spirit of Ashland, took the lives of all these 10 men, and you can't find out anything about it. Well, I'm here to tell you there are possibilities. Among others, by the end of this week, there'll be an article on Wikipedia about this, because I'm writing the damn thing myself. I was hoping to get it done this morning and say, go look at it. Other things happen. And the best thing, though, is I've been working with the Apostle Islands Historic Preservation Conservancy, Wisconsin Landmark Conservancy, and we're going to approach the town board of Bayfield at their next meeting and get official permission to put up a marker on that site. We haven't decided on the exact place to put it, maybe close to the bridge there or at the parking place. Suggestions are welcome. But people are doing things now to mark things. The folks at Bayfield did a wonderful job, Bayfield Town did a wonderful job with their depot there. It's not all that far from where this is. There's reason, there's spirit in the community to do things like that. And as they say, I'm hopeful that by the end of the summer, or at the very farthest next year, we'll have a marker at that spot to let people know about this incident that has been way too badly forgotten. And there, folks, that is my story. I'm sticking to it. If you have any questions, just by all means, yes, please.
Must be your math again.
What did I tell you? had to collate different lists altogether, and I put this slide together in a rough time this morning, and you caught me. Like I said, I have adult supervision though, so it's okay, folks. Bobby Dahl.
Is the railroad just passenger railroad end of Bayville? Because there was some tracks that went to Redcliffe.
I'm sorry, what about the passenger rail?
Did it just end in Bayville and not go to Redcliffe? Because there was railroad tracks.
There was a
in
different,
Bayville and Redcliffe.
right. The Chicago and Omaha ran to Bayfield as its northern terminus. But for a while, there was a different railroad called the Bayfield Transfer Railroad, which had a line that went from Bayfield to Redcliffe and beyond. It was, the Bayfield Transfer Railroad was the brainchild of a North Dakota agricultural tycoon named Oliver Dalrymple. If you know Dalrymple Park, it's named for him. And he had this idea of making Bayfield into a great international port and shipping his grain from the Dakotas out of Bayfield. And he organized this railroad on paper, started a little bit of work, got it going so far as Redcliffe, and things petered out. He passed away. It came into the hands of the Walksmith Lumber Company, and it carried on mostly as a logging railroad, but there were passenger trains to Redcliffe for a short time, and by, about 1915, it was dead. But yeah, good point. Any other questions? Yes, Sharon.
Were these local people?
They were from all over. Some were local, some were from downstate Wisconsin, and there's not much information on others. I would guess that the 5 were buried here. I've got to count as 5, yeah, okay. Were locals, but like I know the engineer was sent down, his remains were sent downstate. I forget exactly where, but some in southern Wisconsin. So we're all over, yeah. Any other questions that don't involve counting? Yes, please.
Yes, Highway 13, as it is known now, was probably just a horse-drawn wagon trail, but it became an official road highway in 1927.
Yeah.
And automobiles were prevalent, and so therefore they didn't want to take the train to go anyplace.
Right. Yeah.
So that's why
The private auto is a kiss of death for passenger service. Even in the best of times, they had no more than 4 trains coming out of Bayfield. Most of the time, they only had 2 passenger trains. And the timing wasn't good, among other things. The timing was not really good to take the train down to Ashland and go shopping. The schedules did not give you people going in that direction enough time to spend the day. There was constantly complaints to the railroad, add another train. You go to the old newspapers, there's always complaining about the number of trains, the time of the trains. Going way off the subject, if you wanted to travel, say, from Duluth, let's say we're going from Sault Ste. Marie down to Milwaukee, let's put it that way. You had 2 railroads. You had what they call the South Shore Line coming along the Upper Peninsula and then towards Superior, east and west. It was a competitor for a while to the Northern Pacific Line. And then you had the Omaha Road going north and south. So folks on the Upper Peninsula who wanted to go to downstate Wisconsin took the South Shore Road as far as Bibbin, where they would wait at a depot there to connect with a train down to Milwaukee. If you've ever been through Bibbin, you know what it was like to be sitting there on a platform for hours waiting for a train. You're in the middle of a humongous swamp. So, as much as other trains, it wasn't necessarily all that convenient. So yeah, the highway, the other thing about the highway is reading into the story of Highway 13, there was tremendous debate about where to put it. Some were advocating put it on the rail bed, the old right-of-way of some of the old logging railroads. There was a lot of bickering between the folks in Bayfield, in Washburn rather, and the folks in Ashland. Folks in Washburn, the merchants here, didn't want to make it too convenient for people to go to Ashland and shop down there. And reading these things through from, the teens, 19 teens to the 20s, as they're deciding on putting the road in. And then there's all the questions of keeping it open during the winter. For the first decade or so, the roads weren't plowed in the winter. It was strictly a summer road. So yeah, not all that long ago. One more question if you have it. Yes, please.
I'm not a trained person, so I apologize. And I would like to know, was this a common occurrence at the time of railroads, or was this like unique one? Like, was this
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Maybe let me come a little
is
closer.
Is it common that?
Was this a common occurrence?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Simple answer, one word answer. You betcha. Yeah, again, if you go through the old newspapers of the time, they would take bulletins from all the equivalent to what were the wire services. And you would always end up having stories of, 12 men killed in a derailment at Oshkosh, 13 men died in a wreck at, Timbuktu, whatever. Yeah. Safety standards in those days were not the kind that we would expect. Among other things, a lot of the cars were made out of wood, and they would have kerosene heaters. So a wreck and the car turns over, you're toast. So yeah, unfortunately, the construction and safety standards we have today are light years ahead of what they would have had then. I guess that's fortunate, really, when it comes right down to it. All right, folks, thank you for coming out, and stop by your
Well, Bob, thank you so much.